Welcome back. We're just going to do the final part of the Pool-Sam Seder debate breakdown. I could have just published it last week, but I kind of got sidetracked. And this sort of starts off at a jumping point where I just had a video that was too long and I cut it into two. So that's about it. Just enjoy.
And make sure they don't know that you're part Korean. We have to lie about a race. Because when I was little, I was specifically told by my family that if I ever told any institution what my race really was, they would discriminate against me based on my race. So when I see Ocasio-Cortez create race equity policies as a wish list, I immediately recoil in horror. I want to make sure that when I apply somewhere, I don't have to lie, and I don't have to tell my kids to lie. But that's the world that's being created by those policies, and that's what scares my family. Especially my dad, who's white, who married into a mixed-race family, who's specifically targeted because he's white. And he's passed over for jobs and promotions. And, my dad's a good sport about it. He says, yeah, life, move on. And he did his thing, and he had no qualms about it. And then I had to contend with the fact that simply because of the way I look, and I'm mixed, so I have to lie. I have to absolutely lie. I'm better off claiming I'm Hispanic than actually telling people what I really am. It's a nightmare that I don't want to live in, and I'm stuck in it because of these policies.
And let me ask you this: how would you address the legacy that we've created in this country for the African American community? We know that up
Class.
until, excuse me,
class-based policy, right? So
there are
economic programs and.
There economic program. Well, like economic programs, like what?
Like giving it.
So this is an idiotic response. Economic programs like what? No, it would be based on income. I would I'm a free marketer. I don't know how we can address class inequality. I would probably say that it's possible. I wouldn't agree with Tim's position, but it would make more sense than race-based issues. But I'll bring in this one. It says, affirming disadvantage. This is from John McWhorter, who is a black professor of linguistics over at, I believe, Columbia now. And he is not only a certified intellectual, one of the top people in his field, and he's taught at Cal Berkeley, and he's obviously he's a black person, but he is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated academics in the world today, specifically because he was willing to go back in. You could probably find, I'll try to put a link, my book review for Losing the Race, which was his 2001 article or book talking about this whole issue. But here's a small taste of it. He says, affirming disadvantage. The old rationales for racial preferences and admissions no longer make any sense. It's time for enlightened America to hit the reset button. And he said this from 2018. And here we go again. Students for Fair Admissions is suing Harvard for bias in its admissions against Asian students. Asians, it turns out, are scored overall as having the least estimable personalities, often knocked down in the stack by notes designating them as not quite interesting or quirky enough, despite top-notch grades, test scores, and extracurricular activities. Slander of hardworking Asian children, pure and simple, and why? Because it makes space for black and Latino students who are much less likely to be designated as too, quote, unexciting to deserve admission. Black students are rated highly on personality in the top 8 deciles. Asian applicants in only the first decile. Overall, a dossier that would give an Asian student a 25% chance of admission gives a black student a virtual guarantee of 95%. Being black gives a Harvard applicant a bonus twice as big as that for a student of any other color under the income bracket of $60,000. So you can read this. I'll put it in the description. There is a paywall, but I think that you get like a free article every month. Maybe I'll put an archive link. But this position that you help black people by discriminating against any other person, whether it's the white people, whether it's the Asians, whether it's the Jews, whether it's whoever, it is a losing proposition. And it's basically trying to guilt Tim Pool by trying to tell him, well, you're going to have to suffer, or your child will have to suffer and not get the best education that he or she can get simply because of a historical injustice that was committed against the ancestors of another group of people that are in some cases just as poor as you.
Admission based on, instead of saying like, if you're Asian, you got to score 1440, we say if your income is below, 30, then you have to score less, or we say we will carve out a section of the school to guarantee low income arrivals.
I mean, I think that's actually, there are folks, Richard Collenberg comes to mind, who is attempting to sort of do that as a way of getting around the bars against sort of, racial quotas. Because when it comes to the distribution of wealth in this country, it matches up quite, sadly, fairly
with
efficient.
Race.
And
right,
so
right. That's why I think class addresses everything.
Well, I mean, I think I don't have a particular argument against that. I think that's one way to go about it. I mean, it's quite clear, though. I mean, you've already let the cat out of the bag that you think that to a certain extent it will provide for more equity for race, and I think you're going to run up against the same problems that the arguments against the Green New Deal are going to engender anyways. I mean,
so right now, at Harvard,
if you look at historically black universities, which is part of a program that at least a couple of the Democrats have proposed in providing more funds for those schools, it's because black people have been systemically shut out of the greatest wealth generator, that is house ownership, in this country since this country was founded. And so these colleges don't have the same opportunity to develop endowments. And so you give that money directly to these historically black universities. That's not class-based, but it is.
So here's the problem with race. Harvard, for instance, has an influx of Chinese immigrants and Indian immigrants. That is checked off as Asian, but it completely ignores Laotians and Vietnamese and Filipinos, who have to lie and pretend to be something else because of wealthy immigrants.
I'm not going to defend Harvard's policy. I don't really know.
But it's not just Harvard. It's across the board. It's not Harvard is the recent lawsuit. But now you have affirmative action policies targeting race instear of class.
Well, you've always had affirmative action programs that targeted race. But where are the Democrats calling for, Harvard's admission policy?
I mean, AOC and other members of the squad have actively defended it and retweeted the ACLU, for instance, that openly defended it.
Well, I mean, you don't anticipate.
So they call for it. I mean, and she puts in the Green New Deal specific race-based equity, economic, cap. I forgot what she called it. It was like racial and economic inequality or something. So the problem is, how do you tell someone that they're you're going to go to Will Smith's kids and be like, you poor kids, you need government benefits. I'm so sorry. That's offensive.
Well,
or do you look at those who are actually in need and say, we're going to do better?
So, interrupting here, we do have this racial snapshot from Prosperity Now, which is sort of a right-wing pro-market think tank that does do a lot of studies on this. And it says Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group of the United States, with the population expected to double in the next 50 years. Asian American is a racial category that includes Americans who are from or whose relatives are from a diverse group of countries: China, Korea, Japan, India, Pakistan, yada, yada, yada. And then, the household median income for Asian Americans is $74,829, 39% greater than the national median income of $53,657. So then Indian Americans have the highest. After Indian Americans comes Filipinos, Japanese, and Chinese Americans. However, there are vast variances in Asian groups in terms of household income, as Bangladeshi Americans have a median income of $51,331, which is almost 50% lower than Indian Americans. So you see a country that's right next to India, the immigrant group that's there is much lower than the Indian group. So there's a lot of variance here, and yet there's this notion that there's not going to be great difference between Asian groups because they're at an advantage over black people. Well, that's actually disputed here. And you actually see here, this is something that you find in a different study, but it says economic insecurity within the Asian American community is evinced by its poverty rates. As of 2011, the Asian American poverty rate was almost 14%, 3% higher than white Americans. When a cost of living adjustment was included, Asian American poverty increased to about 16%, 6% higher than white Americans. And if we examine Asian Americans by nationality, we can find some particularly alarming poverty rates. For example, Hmong, Cambodian, and Laotian Americans tend to be at the bottom of the economic ladder for Asian Americans, with very high poverty rates of about 38, 29, and 18.5% respectively. So it says here, Asian Americans have the lowest unemployment rate across any household of color, with only 3% of the population unemployed. So while you have communities that are very poor, which are some of the Asians, obviously, not all the Asians are poor, they're the working poor in many cases. They're not people who are unemployed and on disability. So we're actually talking about punishing the working poor in many cases in order to pay for a different minority. And it can't be considered fair. I don't care if you're a liberal, conservative, progressive, libertarian. The policy as it is today, which would say to a Laotian, Cambodian, or Hmong American that because you mark the square that says Asian in the survey, you're going to have a less likely chance of getting into school. That is absolutely discriminatory. The same thing is said by Urban Institute, which is more on the liberal side. It says Asian Americans are falling through the cracks in data representation and social services. It says not all Asian Americans are wealthy, and social services aren't reaching those in need. Despite assumptions that all Asian Americans are high earners, 12.3% of Asian Americans live below the federal poverty level, ranging from 6.8% of Filipino Americans to 39.4% of Burmese Americans, according to the American Community Survey. So you do see statistics that are showing that Asians do have a very high poverty rate, yet for some reason, Sam Seder thinks that this can be addressed this can be just ignored as a way of achieving racial justice for Black Americans. So we get to a point a little later where Sam Seder and Tim Pool start to argue over what Bernie Sanders said about white people.
People aren't allowed. And so the white people would then tell me to go to the colored, I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do to address these issues if you're basing everything off race and identity, because I don't have a community. So that makes me very sour on all of this push.
This was regarding Bernie's, or rather Tim Pool's, engagement in Occupy Wall Street, where he said that groups were segregated according to race and sexual orientation and stuff like that.
That we see, because Bernie Sanders said white people don't know what it's like to be poor. And that for me was like...
Bernie Sanders said white people don't know what it's like to be poor?
He absolutely did.
In what context?
So on the debate stage in 2016, he said, if you're white, you don't know what it's like to be poor. You don't know what it's like to live in a ghetto. And I don't know the full quote, but it was essentially it. Those are two key points he said.
I'm familiar with it. I'm
he absolutely said
that.
it.
He's, I've never heard Bernie Sanders being accused of not appreciating poverty of all races. Conceivable he misspoke, but that is not, I think, consistent with everything else that we know about Bernie Sanders. But nevertheless, I mean, I think if you think that the left has a problem with race, Tim, you should wait till you
I don't like the Republicans.
Wait till you find out what's happening on the right. And
so in what capacity, though? Because, when I go and talk to like a Trump supporter, my race never comes up. I'm never asked about it. When I go and talk to,
So this is a case where Bernie actually contradicts himself. Later I guess he ended up correcting himself. He did apologize, in fact, for what he said. And he has said, this is what's really baffling, that he said what he said, knowing that he's also gone to rural areas of America, like Kentucky, West Virginia, Iowa, Nebraska, I believe he's been to, his own state of Vermont, and he's told poor white people that he's going to get a better deal for them and try to get them reintegrated into the economy where, neoliberalism, as the left calls it, has isolated them from it. But this is him actually saying what Tim Pool is talking about, and Sam Seder has never seen this.
Some young people active in the Black Lives Matter movement. Young lady comes up to me and she says, "You don't understand what police do in certain black communities. You don't understand the degree to which we are terrorized." And I'm not just talking about the horrible shootings that we have seen, which have got to end, and we've got to hold police officers accountable. I'm just talking about everyday activities where police officers are bullying people. So to answer your question, I would say, and I think it's similar to what the secretary said, when you're white, you don't know what it's like to be living in a ghetto. You don't know what it's like to be poor. You don't know what it's like to be hassled when you walk down the street or you get dragged out of a car. And I believe that as a nation in the year 2016, we must be firm in making it clear we will end institutional racism and reform a broken criminal justice system. And we got to transform our national.
Yo, you gotta move it.
We spend $80 billion a year locking people up in this country. We wouldn't have to do that if people had jobs and if people had education. And we've got to transform our national.
So Bernie actually contradicts himself on this. He called Baltimore the third world country at one point, which in progressive circles nowadays would probably get him in trouble because you're not supposed to say third world anymore. Now they call it the global south, but they would probably give him a pass.
We spend $80 billion a year locking people up in this country. We wouldn't have to do that if people had jobs and if people had education. And we've got to transform our national priorities, invest in our kids, invest in housing, rather than more and more jails. The fact of the matter is that America is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. But anyone who took the walk that we took around this neighborhood would not think you're in a wealthy nation. You would think that you were in a third world country. We do not need to give more tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires. We need to start investing in communities all over this country today that are hurting.
So then you might wonder, well, maybe did he correct himself after what he said about West Virginia? Because did he not know that there's a lot of poor white people in the country? It's not true, because this is from 2013, where he said there is tremendous inequality in America today. Unemployment is much too high. Wages and income are too low. Millions of Americans are struggling to find affordable health care. And the widening gap between the very rich and everyone else is growing wider. And then he talked about McDowell County in West Virginia. So what's the demographic of McDowell County? You can see it is right now 9.5% black, 89.1% white. So therefore, at the time, he already knew that there is a lot of very, very poor white people. In fact, there was a woman who I guess testified to it from West Virginia who is noticeably not black. So people need to really figure out what the hell they're talking about. Sam Seder is willfully ignorant. It says at the county level, Fairfax County, West Virginia, which sits just outside of Washington, D.C., has the highest average life expectancy in the nation, with an average of 82 years. Just 350 miles away in McDowell County, West Virginia, the life expectancy for men is just 64 years, an 18-year difference. Men in McDowell County have the same life expectancy as men in Namibia. For women, The county in the U.S. with the highest life expectancy is sunny and wealthy Marin County, California, which is where San Francisco is, where the average is 85 years. The lowest in the nation is Perry County, Kentucky, with an average life expectancy of 73 years, a 12-year gap. The life expectancy for women in McDowell County, West Virginia, where life expectancy is second lowest in the country, falling closely behind Perry County, is equivalent to that of Mongolia. So I think that'll be it for today. And I know that there were many, many issues in this, including the immigration that I could have gone after. But look, Sam Seder, I would say, is a prime exhibit of people who consider themselves the intellectual vanguard of the left, but all they do is they read sources of their own. I've brought you sources from John McWhorter, who is a staunch liberal. He was an Obama supporter. I've brought you from an Asian reporter at the Stanford Daily Cardinal opinion piece. I've brought you some stuff about poverty from the Pew Research Center. I've brought you stuff from Prosperity Now, which is a more conservative source. I've brought you stuff from the Urban Institute, which is a little more liberal. And from the Baltimore Sun, and from Bernie Sanders himself. So Sam Seder is living in his own bubble, where even things that politicians that he supports, he seems to effectively ignore. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute, Minds, and on Subscribestar if you want to donate. All those are at Chef Leopard, and on Gab at Starscream85. And I will talk to you later.
Inside my future eye, what I see just makes me cry.